wanted to talk to you today about miniatures or miniaturization and my love of small things. I'm not sure it's a love, it's more of a kind of obsession and sometimes a torment. If you're wondering why I'm sitting on the desk, the light is best here. I've always been, first of all as a child, fascinated and delighted by the miniature or tiny things, and then as I got older it became kind of an obsession and would often lead me down a track which I didn't get off of until I was either ill or the work I was making had been kind of sabotaged by myself. I love works of literature and art which focus on small things. For instance, I love Klimt's work, his detail, his intricacy, his pattern. I love Van Gogh's work, the tiny brush strokes, the rhythmic forms, the tiny people that sometimes appear in his work. And the way he focuses on small things, for instance, a pair of boots or some sunflowers, as if they were just as important as a panoramic view, although he does, actually one of my favourite pictures of his does have a large view of countryside as well. I also remember seeing some of John Ruskin's sketches in the Ashmolean at Oxford, and I really fell in love with them. Partly I love sketches and unfinished things, but also I simply love the detail and his draftsmanship, the lines, the pen and ink lines and the pencil lines, and the delineation of such tiny things in such, I felt an exquisite way. I've also, in thinking about making this video, I've also realised that lots of the authors I love best focus on something small. So for instance, Marilyn Robinson, I love her most because of her language, which is, gosh, I feel epiphanic and incandescent and spiritual. I got mocked for praising spiritual greatness in authors by one reviewer who'd looked at some blog entries on my website. But I was trying to suggest the type of writing that elevates prose from what we normally experience when we read it, elevates it into something else. It's not poetry, it's not prose, but it's something very precious, and spiritual was the only word I could think of. But also a lot of the writers I love which do this, for instance Emily Dickinson or Gerard Manley Hopkins or John Clare or even Walt Whitman, who focus on very small things like a fly or a bird, a small bird. I'm thinking of Little Trotty Wagtail by John Clare, or the poem by Emily Dickinson which begins, "A fly buzzed the day I died," I think. And Walt Whitman's, his masterpiece is called Leaves of Grass. How much smaller can you get? So often I find this spiritual or mystical writing focuses on very small phenomena, and that's what inspires me and that's what I love. And I guess everyone has a little inbuilt, I'm sorry, I'm quite tired today. Had lots of tea, coffee and Coca-Cola and water, and I still can't get it together. But everyone has a sort of inbuilt sat-nav, a sort of little homing device, homing and honing. It tells them where to go or tells them where their inspiration can be found, and mine seems to direct me to the small scale, to the so-called homely, to the unassuming, and hence I guess I like a lot of writers that also are drawn to such things. As I mentioned, Marilyn Robinson. Through Marilyn Robinson I also learned of a writer called Paul Harding, who wrote a book called Tinkers, which was absolutely extraordinary, and it not only focused on small objects and small occurrences and a small person's life, a tinker. I remember one passage in which he described the contents of a little chest of, well, a big chest of drawers on the cart that this tinker would take with him. It not only focuses on small things and describes them in exquisite and pinpointed detail, but through the small, it enlarges into prose that's suggesting at times things we can only glimpse at, things that we're not sure we've comprehended or apprehended. And the very form of that novel dissolves quite a few times, and it's as if there are a few nebulae of further novels within the novel that could have been developed, but that he didn't. And again, I love that, because it's like the unfinished suggestion of something like a sketch. And actually thinking about it, lots of mystics and spiritual teachers use small and humble things as gateways or as teaching devices in order to illustrate and put their disciples or readers in touch with something enormous. And I'm sure any of you who've read The Land of Decoration will see a lot of these fascinations and concerns reflected in that novel. A couple of other writers I love, in fact all my favourite writers, focus on small worlds. I'm thinking of novels by Charlotte Bronte which deal with a very singular, insular and sometimes closeted protagonist in a claustrophobic world, for instance Jane Eyre or Villette. And I'm thinking of the minutiae of daily life in Virginia Woolf's novels, which form the stream of consciousness she paints so masterfully, in which a detail can be both harrowing and epiphanic. I'm thinking of the start of Mrs. Dalloway, for instance, when just the rush of summer air through some doors, sort of big windows, French doors, conjure up a summer long gone by. And because I myself am very sensitive to smells or sounds and sensations, writers which work by means of engaging with those things resonate very deeply with me. And actually Joyce, even though his masterpiece Ulysses is epic, it's comprised of a stream of consciousness which dwells and delights and revels in detail. So I wouldn't say Joyce is one of my favourite writers. I'm of course in awe of him, but again, I love the detail of his work. And more recently, a writer like Karl Ove Knausgård. I like him for so many reasons. I admire him for so many reasons, but the fact that he lends, for instance, cornflakes as much weight and time in his narrative as interchanges between the protagonist and key people or key events in the protagonist's life seems to me right. I think I just have a hunch, and I have no kind of mystical experience or no evidence to prove any of this, but I just feel that small things in life are as important, or in other words, everything in life is as important as another thing. And novels like, say, Middlemarch or War and Peace or I was going to say Underworld by Don DeLillo, but I do love Underworld. But generally, novels that deal with the epic, they just don't do it for me. I like the small scale. W.G. Sebald, of course. Now, this is an interesting example of a writer using the details of history and scraps of paper, photographs, smells, the sensation of a bar of soap, to suggest the weight of time past and the weight of ourselves slipping into non-existence. So detail can actually be used very, very effectively to suggest the enormous and the unfathomable and the unspeakable. I'm also thinking of a writer I was so impressed by recently called Claire Louise Bennett, whose debut novel is called Pond, and in it the protagonist is very insular. It's autofiction, by the way. The protagonist is very insular. She lives in a cottage, we don't know where, and she is so, it's as if the the skin between herself and the tiny world she inhabits, because mostly we just are with her in, say, the kitchen or the garden or a bedroom or the landing. The skin between her and the world is permeable, and her identity effectively reconfigures itself as she interacts with, say, bananas going brown in a bowl, or the control knobs on a cooker, or an uneven assortment of stones in a wall. Now, that writer is using minutiae which many writers would glide over and not even see, in order to explore the boundaries of the self in quite a mystical way. And I would again say that that writing is spiritual, and risk being ridiculed for using the word spiritual. But anyway, so I think I've more or less made my point there. I'm just thinking, I wrote some writers down. I wonder if I've missed any. Yeah, Anita Bruckner. I've written Anita Bruckner, the excruciation of apparently minor comments, gestures and actions. To be fair, I've only read Look at Me by Anita Bruckner, which was recommended to me by my friend Lucy. And I'd never even heard of Anita Bruckner actually before I was talking to Lucy about her, which is awful, but there are quite big gaps in my knowledge because anyway, there are. And so I was mesmerized and traumatized by that novel. And it's not as if anything is really ever stated. You're not really sure what's happened at the end, but you know that the character has gone through something that has shaken her to her soul, and that has happened by means of tiny words, gestures, glances. And the atmosphere of that novel, atmosphere is probably the first thing that attracted me to writing. The atmosphere of that novel is so pungent, so heady, it's frightening, it's brilliant. Just on the note of atmosphere, I think two of the first books that inspired me in a kind of writerly or literary sense are, when I was a child, Charlotte's Web and Little House on the Prairie. And I mean the actual book called Little House on the Prairie, not the whole series. Although the whole series I loved, but especially the book called Little House on the Prairie and Charlotte's Web. Both of those I felt conjured a very palpable atmosphere by means of evocation of detail. I remember the description of the barn in Charlotte's Web and being really, really inspired by that, by the multifarious shapes and objects and shadows and textures and sounds of this barn in summer. So I've always, my love, fascination and obsession with detail is long rooted. I don't know where it came from. I just tend to always look down and look in rather than up and out. But what I'm trying to say is looking down and in, I don't think necessarily obviates what is gained by looking up and out. I think they're two roads to the same destination. Just going to have a drink because my throat's quite husky today. I just wanted to also say that those of you who haven't read Gerard Manley Hopkins' prose really should, because it's extraordinary. His description of raindrops, he has a whole kind of private mythology, a kind of a theory and of thought, and I have to refamiliarize myself with this, but I think he even has his own language, his own words, but he is trying to penetrate the essence of things through language. And it reminded me of Vincent van Gogh's, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say Gogh properly. Hoch? Apparently that's the Hoch. Anyway, he also, because I know a bit about Vincent because for an A-level project I wrote about him, and I read all of his letters, which affected me very deeply. He is a very, he's a writer as well as a painter, and his writing does stay with you, at least it stayed with me. And he also expressed this, it was a burning and haunting mission with Vincent to capture the essence of things. And both he and Gerard Manley Hopkins, their gaze is captured by detail. And I think I've also been, I would say, haunted by the same desire to capture the essence of something, and my tendency is to look at the small. I remember when I was about 4 or 5, apparently I was trying to describe a certain type of red, and to my nan, to my grandmother, I apparently said red with the top skimmed off because I couldn't think of how to describe the type of red. And even as a kid, I wrote to try and capture the essence of things. Well, of course, you might say that's crazy. There isn't one essence of anything, but there is to every person. And I suppose Van Gogh and Hopkins were trying to capture the essence of the world as they saw and felt it. Anyway, moving on a little bit from, just checking it's still recording, it is. Moving on a bit from artists and writers that inspire me. Oh, I also want to say I like Carl Larson, sorry. And you see, sometimes I worry that, well, I don't worry, but I'm not worried at all, but sometimes it occurs to me that my taste in art is very unsophisticated. Of course, Klimt and Van Gogh, lots of people admire them, but they're also very popular artists. They're not obscure or incredibly highbrow, at least I don't think, but who cares? I mean, people also mock Beethoven, and I worship Beethoven. Anyway, Carl Larson, is he even a painter? I guess so, but it's almost as if his... hang on a minute, I have to go and turn the TV off.